Welcome to Come Follow Me, Canadian Style. We're in the Doctrine and Covenants, Section 2. We're also going to cover Joseph Smith history, verses 27 to the end. Remember, last week we covered what happens when a 14-year-old full of faith asks questions of God. Well, you get revelation. What kind of person was Joseph Smith as a kid, as a child? At 12, he was serious about religion. His family was obviously religious. He worried a lot about his sins. At 13, he was called as a witness in a court. The judge thought he was a very credible witness. He was fun-loving, a bit of a prankster. He liked to laugh, but he was respectful and thoughtful. The kind of kid you would want to teach in your Sunday school class, really. So let's jump in section 2, a very short section. This is an extract from Joseph Smith history and relates to the words that the angel Moroni spoke to Joseph Smith during the visitation of September 21st, 1823. Verse 1. Behold, I will reveal unto you the priesthood by the hand of Elijah the prophet, before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he shall plant in the hearts of the children the promises made to the fathers, and the hearts of the children shall turn to their fathers. If it were not so, the whole earth would be utterly wasted at his coming. This is a very, very important scripture, and it is in each of our standard works. Notice that in verse 2, it's often misquoted, and he shall plant in the hearts of their children the promises made to the fathers. The fathers here refers to their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the hearts of the children shall turn to their fathers, which means our immediate ancestors. And if not, then the whole earth would be completely wasted at the coming of Christ. But let's jump into Joseph Smith history. Verse 27. I continued to pursue my common vocations in life until the 21st of September, 1823, all the time suffering severe persecution at the hands of all classes of men, both religious and irreligious, because I continued to affirm that I had seen a vision. Remember what happened when he told the local minister about his vision. He was totally discounted, and thus began persecution, severe persecution, throughout the rest of his life. So what was his common job, his vocation? He was a day laborer, a farmer. His family was really poor, and everyone in the family had to work in order for them to survive. Alvin, his older brother, was a main contributor. He was old enough to have his own farm, and yet he stayed home to help his aging parents, who had seen many, many reversals over the previous decades. Some people have suggested that Alvin actually worked on the Erie Canal, where it was possible to earn $14 a month, and it was mostly Alvin who had made the payment on the farm of $100 per year. Verse 28. During the space of time which intervened between the time I had the vision and the year 1823, having been forbidden to join any of the religious sects of the day, and being of very tender years, and persecuted by those who ought to have been my friends, and to have treated me kindly, and if they supposed me to be deluded, to have endeavored in a proper and affectionate manner to have reclaimed me, I was left to all kinds of temptations and mingling with all kinds of society. I frequently fell into many foolish errors, and displayed the weakness of youth and the foibles of human nature, which I am sorry to say led me into diverse temptations, offensive in the sight of God. In making this confession, no one need suppose me guilty of any great or malignant sins. A disposition to commit such was never in my nature, but I was guilty of levity, and sometimes associated with jovial company, etc., not consistent with the character which ought to be maintained by one who was called of God as I had been. But this will not seem very strange to anyone who recollects my youth and is acquainted with my native cheery temperament. In consequence of these things, I often felt condemned for my weakness and imperfections. When on the evening of the above-mentioned 21st of September, after I had retired to my bed for the night, I betook myself to prayer and supplication to Almighty God for forgiveness of all my sins and follies, and also for a manifestation to me that I might know of my state and standing before him. for I had full confidence in obtaining a divine manifestation as I previously had one. While I was thus in the act of calling upon God, I discovered a light appearing in my room, which continued to increase until the room was brighter than at noonday, when immediately a personage appeared at my bedside, standing in the air, for his feet did not touch the ground. So he is basically looking for forgiveness for the silly things that he had done. Remember, he had had no visions for 3.5 years. Also remember back in verse 28 that he didn't have very many good friends, and he basically displayed the weakness of youth. So what is a good friend? Good friends treat you kindly, and if you're deluded, they try to reclaim you. The idea of a good friend today really is full of falsehood. Today we're told that a good friend won't get you in trouble, and they just take you as you are. But that's not true. A true friend will say no when you're trying to do something that's dumb. I'm going to introduce you to Franklin the Turtle and his friend Snail. This is a wonderful cartoon series that I remember watching with my children decades ago. In one episode that I remember distinctly, Franklin and Snail are playing on the same soccer team, and Snail, although scoring a goal, breaks his shell or puts a crack in it, and it causes a lot of pain. And he says to Franklin, "Don't tell my mother because I will have to stop playing soccer," and he loved playing soccer. Franklin then goes on to ask his mother, "Do cracks in a shell heal by themselves?" And his mother explains, "Well, not usually, and they're very painful, and they can do serious damage." Franklin decides that it's more important that Snail get his shell fixed. So he tells Snail, "Either you tell your mother or I will. Remember, you need good friends." This becomes even more important in the life of Joseph Smith later. Verse 30 of Joseph Smith History number 1. While I was thus in the act of calling upon God, I discovered a light appearing in my room, which continued to increase until the room was lighter than at noonday, when immediately a personage appeared at my bedside, standing in the air, for his feet did not touch the ground. So if we go back to the story of Joseph Smith, the first visit of Moroni, Moroni comes and tells Joseph that his sins are forgiven and that the Lord has a work for him to do. Verse 33, he called me by name and said unto me that he was a messenger sent from the presence of God, and that his name was Moroni, and that God had a work for me to do, and that my name should be had for good and evil among all nations, kindreds, and tongues, or that it should be both good and evil spoken of among all people. He said there was a book deposited, written upon gold plates, giving an account of the former inhabitants of this continent, and the source from whence they sprang. He also said that the fullness of the everlasting gospel was contained in it, as delivered by the Savior to the ancient inhabitants. I did a Google search today for Joseph Smith and got 1,300,000,000 results. Elder John H. Groberg of the 70 told of an experience in which he saw a fulfillment of Moroni's prophecy. While serving as a missionary in the South Pacific, Elder Groberg visited a remote island named, I don't know how to pronounce that, Tafahai, which had only 18 homes and no electricity or running water. He asked the family living in this home if they had ever heard of the President of the United States. They said, "Who's he and where's the United States?" I tried to explain where it was, but they couldn't understand. They asked how big an island it was. I replied that it was a very big island, thousands of miles away, with millions of people living on it. I told them that many people there had never seen the ocean, and that many people didn't know one another. They couldn't comprehend that. He then asked them about the leaders of Russia and France, but they could not answer his questions. I took a deep breath and said, "Have you ever heard of Joseph Smith?" Immediately their faces lit up. Everyone looked at me, and the father said, "Don't talk to us about that false prophet. Not in our home. We know all about him. Our minister has told us." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. The scripture sounded in my mind that Joseph's name should be had for good and evil among all nations. To me, this was a direct fulfillment of prophecy. I am convinced that you could hardly get a place more remote, more out of touch with modern civilization than that little island. The people there knew nothing of the great leaders of the day, political, economic, or otherwise, but they knew the name of Joseph Smith. In this case, they knew it for ill, at least to begin with. I spent the next few days explaining more of the mission of the prophet Joseph Smith, and before we left, a few of them knew his name for good. Back to Joseph Smith History 1, verse 36. After telling me these things, he commenced quoting the prophecies of the Old Testament. He first quoted part of the 3rd chapter of Malachi, and he quoted also the 4th or last chapter of the same prophecy, though with little variation from the way it reads in our Bibles. Instead of quoting the first verse as it reads in our books, he quoted it thus: For behold, the day cometh that shall burn as an oven, and the proud, yea, and all that do wickedly shall burn as stubble. For they that come shall burn them, saith the Lord of hosts, that it shall leave them neither root nor branch. Leaving neither root nor branch means they're disconnected from their family, from their progeny, and from their ancestors. And then verse 38, he quoted the 5th verse thus: Behold, I will reveal unto you the priesthood by the hand of Elijah the prophet, before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Now that's interesting, because the priesthood is revealed to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery through John the Baptist and through Peter, James, and John. But this priesthood is a little different. It refers to the sealing power of the priesthood. Verse 39. He also quoted the next verse differently. And he shall plant in the hearts of the children the promises made to the fathers, and the hearts of the children shall turn to their fathers. Again, notice the fathers and their fathers. There's a distinction here. If it were not so, the whole earth would be utterly wasted at his coming. So he begins teaching Joseph right from day one about temple work, Malachi 3 and 4, and also about Elijah and the family history and turning children to parents and the redemption of the dead. If this doesn't happen, our time on earth will be completely wasted. Verse 40. In addition to these, he quoted the 11th chapter of Isaiah, saying that it was about to be fulfilled. He quoted also the 3rd chapter of Acts, 22nd and 23rd verses, precisely as they stand in our New Testament. He said that the prophet was Christ, but the day had not yet come when they who would not hear his voice should be cut off from among the people, but soon would come. He also quoted the 2nd chapter of Joel from the 28th verse to the last. He also said that this was not yet fulfilled, but was soon to be. And he further stated that the fullness of the Gentiles was soon to come. He quoted many other passages of scriptures and offered many explanations which cannot be mentioned here. The idea of the fullness of the Gentiles means that the nations of the earth, not the Israelites, would be responsible for bringing forth more of the church, more of the gospel, more of the restoration. So let's look at Isaiah 11 or 2 Nephi 21, where it says, And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and the branch shall grow out of its roots. So this is a prophecy of Christ. Jesse was, of course, the father of David. You remember David and Goliath, who became eventually King David, and where it is prophesied that Christ would be a descendant of King David, and thus from the stem of Jesse. Acts 3 is actually a rewrite of Deuteronomy 18:15-19. For Moses truly said unto the fathers, A prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me. Him shall ye hear in all things whatsoever he shall say unto you. And it shall come to pass that every soul which will not hear the prophet shall be destroyed from among the people. So who's this prophet? Obviously, this is Christ. Moses is saying that Christ will come. Remember what it said back in verse 40 of Joseph Smith History, that the prophet was Christ, but the day had not yet come when they who would not hear his voice should be cut off from among the people, but soon would come. This is, of course, referring to the second coming. Joel 2:28, And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. And then it goes on to talk about the wonders in heaven and what will happen at the second coming. This is the wrapping up scene which will be here shortly, the final act. And of course, we talked about last week, many of Joseph's ancestors had dreamed dreams. And of course, Joseph had seen visions. Also note in verse 41 of Joseph Smith History that he quoted many other passages of scripture and offered many explanations which cannot be mentioned here. So Joseph actually knew a lot more than he ever said. So why did he hold back? Well, I think people weren't ready for it. He often said of himself, if he hadn't experienced what he had, he wouldn't even believe it. So Joseph fed the saints what he could as quickly as they were willing to accept it, but he knew a lot more. So how many times did Moroni visit Joseph? Well, according to President George Q. Cannon, Joseph Smith was visited constantly by angels. Moroni, in the beginning, as you know, to prepare him for his mission, came and ministered and talked to him from time to time. And he had vision after vision in order that his mind might be fully saturated with the knowledge of the things of God, and that he might comprehend the great and holy calling that God had bestowed upon him. So verse 44. I lay musing on the singularity of this scene, and marveling greatly at what had been told to me by this extraordinary messenger, when in the midst of my meditation I suddenly discovered that my room was again beginning to get lighted, and in an instant, as it were, the same heavenly messenger was again by my side. He commenced and again related the very same thing which he had done at his first visit, without the least variation, which having done, he informed me of great judgments which were coming upon the earth, with great desolations by famine, sword, and pestilence, and that these grievous judgments would come on the earth in this generation. Having related these things, he again ascended as he had done before. I heard a podcast this week, which was kind of interesting, where the guest of the podcaster said, imagine appearing in the middle of the night to a 14-year-old and then quoting a bunch of Old Testament scriptures. Of course, you'd have to tell them the same thing 3 times and then again the next day, otherwise they'd never remember. So this second visit reinforced the first visit and was all about the great judgments that were coming. Remember, this was said in 1823. And if you just look at the aspect of wars, we have the Civil War, we have World War I, we have World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Iraqi War, all the things that are going on with Iran and with Russia, and it has been a mess since the coming of Moroni. Certainly great judgments are upon the earth today. Just look at the news. 46. By this time, so deep were the impressions made on my mind that sleep had fled from my eyes, and I lay overwhelmed in astonishment at what I had both seen and heard. But what was my surprise when again I beheld the same messenger at my bedside, and heard him rehearse or repeat over again to me the same things as before, and added a caution to me, telling me that Satan would try to tempt me, in consequence of the indigent circumstances of my father's family, to get the plates for the purpose of getting rich. This he forbade me, saying that I must have no other object in view in getting the plates but to glorify God, and must not be influenced by any other motive than that of building his kingdom, otherwise I could not get them. So on the third visit, remember that Joseph Smith is very, very poor. Verse 48. I shortly after arose from my bed. Now remember, this whole interview happened through the nighttime, so 8 to 10 hours long, and possibly even 12 hours long. And during the 3 visits, what we have occurring here is not very much. So you can see that Joseph actually was taught a lot more than what he's telling us. And as usual, he arose from his bed and went to the necessary labors of the day. But in attempting to work as at other times, I found my strength so exhausted as to render me entirely unable. My father, who was laboring along with me, discovered something to be wrong with me and told me to go home. I started with the intention of going to the house, but in attempting to cross the fence out of the field where we were, my strength entirely failed me, and I fell helpless on the ground, and for a time was quite unconscious of anything. And then, of course, Moroni comes again and commands him to go and tell his father about the vision. So he tells his father, who immediately believes him. And that's really interesting, because imagine your 14-year-old coming and telling you a story and you immediately believe him, because Joseph did not lie. He had never told lies. Joseph Sr. tells him to do as the Lord commands. So Joseph heads off to the hill Cumorah. Then, verse 55, as my father's worldly circumstances were very limited, we were under the necessity of laboring with our hands, hiring out by day's work and otherwise, as we could get opportunity. Sometimes we were at home and sometimes abroad, meaning he didn't always sleep at home, and by continuous labor were enabled to get a comfortable maintenance. In the year 1823, my father's family met with great affliction by the death of my eldest brother, Alvin. Now remember the last thing that Moroni told Joseph before his command to tell his father. He was told that he would have no other object in view but to get the plates and to glorify God, but must not be influenced by any other motive than that of building his kingdom. Otherwise, he could not get them. 53. I made an attempt to take them out, meaning the plates, but was forbidden by the messenger, and was again informed that the time for bringing them forth had not yet arrived, neither would it until 4 years from that time. He didn't know that 4 years would pass, but again, you remember he's writing this in 1838. But he told me that I should come to the place precisely in 1 year from that time, and that he would there meet with me, and that I should continue to do so until the time should come for obtaining the plates. Accordingly, as I had been commanded, I went at the end of each year, and at each time I found the messenger there, and received instructions and intelligence from him at each of our interviews respecting what the Lord was going to do, and how and in what manner his kingdom was to be conducted in the last days. Now remember back in verse 28, they talked about the weakness of youth. So according to Oliver Cowdery, he tried to take the plates, but was shocked 3 times. He asked Moroni, who says he failed to keep his mind in control. And then from letters by Oliver to W. Phelps, which were recorded in the Latter-day Saints Messenger and Advocate in 1835, it speaks about the weakness of youth, that it was 5 kilometers or 3 miles from Joseph's house to the hill Cumorah, and during that time traveling, walking there, he was constantly thinking about his family's financial situation and the gold plates. And so that's why he wasn't able to take them. Plus, he was quite young. He was only 17 at the time, almost 18. The mind of a youth is easily turned, and experience is needed to overcome opposing forces. Remember, the antidote for youth is experience. Verse 56, I hired with an old gentleman by the name of Josiah Stoll, who lived in Chenango County, state of New York. He had heard something of a silver mine having been opened by the Spaniards in Harmony, state of Pennsylvania, and had previous to my hiring to him, been digging in order, if possible, to discover the mine. After I went to live with him, he took me with the rest of his hands, meaning the people that worked for him, to dig for the silver mine, at which I continued to work for nearly a month, without success in our undertaking, and finally I prevailed with the old gentleman to cease digging after it. Hence arose a very prevalent story of my being a money digger. Verse 57, during the time that I was thus employed, I was put to board with Mr. Isaac Hale of that place. It was there I first saw my wife, his daughter, Emma Hale. On the 18th of January, 1827, we were married while I was yet employed in the service of Mr. Stoll. Owing to my continuing to assert that I had seen a vision, persecution still followed me, and my wife's father's family were very much opposed to our being married. I was therefore under the necessity of taking her elsewhere, so he goes to another part of New York and is married, and then they move to his father's home and farm with him. So Joseph marries Emma, they actually elope, and Emma replaces Alvin as Joseph's rock. He is told on the 3rd visit to the hill Cumorah to bring someone with him, and you will know who. And when he said that, he immediately thought of Emma. The trial to get the plates was a growing experience for Joseph. Emma is his best friend and wife. Remember from the story of Franklin that you need good friends. And the antidote for weakness of youth is time and experience. Verse 62, by this timely aid he had received $50 from Martin Harris. I was enabled to reach the place of my destination in Pennsylvania, and immediately after my arrival there I commenced copying the characters off the plates. I copied a considerable number of them by means of the Urim and Thummim. I translated some of them, which I did between the time I arrived at the house of my wife's father in the month of December and the February following. Sometime in this month of February, the aforementioned Mr. Martin Harris came to our place, got the characters which I had drawn off the plates, and started with them to the city of New York. And so we'll talk about that story a little later. So Joseph doesn't know how to translate. He basically experiments with the Urim and Thummim. Martin Harris takes a copy of these characters to New York for verification by 2 experts. This is, of course, a fulfillment of the prophecy in Isaiah that is also mentioned in the Book of Mormon. After Joseph gets the plates, Emma, Martin Harris, and Oliver Cowdery act as his scribes. There's a lot more information here that we really don't have time to go into, but I highly recommend that you read Saints Volume 1, which covers this extensively. While translating the Book of Mormon in 3rd Nephi, as describing Christ's visit to America, they learn about baptism. Joseph has never been baptized, and John the Baptist comes and gives the Aaronic priesthood and commands them to baptize each other. Then a month later, they receive the higher priesthood from Peter, James, and John, the Melchizedek priesthood. There's also a very interesting story in Saints about Mary Whitmer, who's overburdened. She already has a very large family, and with the arrival of Joseph and Emma and Oliver there to finish the translation, and with these 3 additional people, her already large household has expanded greatly and has increased her workload. And so the Lord allows her to see the gold plates. This is detailed in Volume 1 of this series, Saints. I really highly recommend that you read these along with your study of the Doctrine and Covenants, because the first volume covers the years 1815 to 1846 and has excellent stories in it. Well, we're at the end of our study again this week. I had to kind of breeze through it, but I hope you enjoyed it and that you will dive deeper into it. Read Volume 1 of the Saints, or even just listen to it. It's available on the Gospel Library app and is free. I testify that these things that we've talked about today are so important. Joseph Smith was guided to bring back, to restore to the earth, the ability for us to be restored to heaven. He teaches us, and it's outlined in the Doctrine and Covenants, how we can understand about why the temple is here and our connection to the ancestors and to our ancestors, to the Abrahamic covenant, and to linking all of our families together so that we can return to live with God and that the earth isn't wasted. Have a great week. Have fun studying. I'll see you next week.